The ethos of Joseph Fares and Hazelight Studios is
that we f up in every level.
Did you have a eureka moment when you came up with that? All right, we f up, and you write it on the whiteboard. This is our mantra.
It's always the Hazelight mantra. I've been there since day one.
Now you can see this philosophy in play across every department. One place, however, where I'd argue is insufficiently f***ed is the writing. I'm Jake Sidwell. I've been writing personally for 25 years and professionally for 10. I've worked in an editorial and developmental capacity and as a punch-up writer for the animated sci-fi show Final Space. I'm also a co-writer on the Final Space tie-in graphic novel and a co-author on the action sci-fi novel Forward as Always. But more importantly, I've been DMing Dungeons & Dragons campaigns for over 8 years. I'm also 80,000 words deep drafting my first book of the fantasy series based on my Dungeons & Dragons campaigns. If I'm going to be talking about writing, I think it's important to establish here at the top, I do have some meaningful experience. Now, I'm not interested in disparaging the writers of Split Fiction. This was obviously a colossal task, and a game of this size doesn't get made without love. You can feel it when you play it. If the developers love what they're doing, players get a better experience. But the truth is, love isn't always enough. Writing is hard, it takes time, and its subjectivity makes the quality difficult to judge. So I will only be addressing the script as is. This is not an exercise in tearing down my potential colleagues. These are people I want to work with. I have nothing but love for the devs at Hazelight, and I cannot wait for their next game. I also highly, highly endorse Split Fiction as a labor of love worthy of your money and your time. But I wouldn't be making this video if I didn't feel like I could help them improve a future script. Which brings me to my last point before we get into the meat of this video. Yes, I applied for the recent writer's position that opened up at Hazelight Studios, and my application was rejected. Though I seem to have been at least at one point in consideration. So like a normal person, in response to that rejection, I rewrote the entire first act of Split Fiction in 22 days. Well, no one asked me to do this, but it's done. Here are the bullet points I made almost a month ago when I knew I was going to have to do this, when I became possessed. Now that the demon has left my body, though, now that I'm done, and I have a sense of clarity, this really feels like it was an exercise in futility. This video will just be going over the first half, otherwise this video would be several hours long. My computer would probably catch fire trying to render it, and the open position at Hazelight Studios would certainly be filled. My hope is that also applies to the application process, so this is my official reapplication for that position. I hope you'll reconsider. In order to address the story problems in Split Fiction, it isn't enough to simply rewrite the script with stronger dialogue, although that will help. We first need to understand what the foundational issues are so we can rebuild more confidently. Split Fiction has an issue of identity, where it's telling you it's one thing, but showing you it's another. So let's start with the most obvious example. Now, I would contend, as far as the game is presented, that Mio and Zoe are not actually writers. I also think this is the central problem with Split Fiction's intended narrative. Now, this doesn't mean that Mio and Zoe aren't creatives. They clearly are. But what we're talking about here is an issue of definition. Writers write, but there's very little writing going on in their stories. So, if they're not writers, what are they? In my opinion, they're solo game developers. All of their stories are based around mechanics and interaction, not around characters and conflict, not around story. And the characters and conflict that we do get inside their stories are so far and few between that it mostly feels like disjointed narrative beats sandwiched between hours of non-narrative gameplay. Now, I want to say, I don't think that this is a problem generally and works for all kinds of games, but for a game specifically called Split Fiction, I think we need more fiction. Imagine these two are indie game devs who are looking to work with a large publisher or some other iteration which isn't about fiction. I think the premise works. Very little needs to be changed for the narrative to work besides maybe some language changes. But if we're to honor the title and not rewrite this game about the struggles of independent game development, then we have to take seriously what the game is trying to do and determine whether it succeeds in that endeavor. The distinguishing factor that determines whether something is a game is interaction. You don't interact with a book, you read it. You don't interact with a movie or a television show, you watch it. You don't interact with a song, you listen to it. These things are happening to you, not you to them. You can, of course, critically engage with these types of media as an exercise of engagement, but with extremely rare exceptions, you aren't invited to participate as a consequence of the experience. But with a game, the very thing that qualifies it is participation. You aren't playing a game if you aren't participating. Dodgeball, Dungeons & Dragons, Solitaire, Monopoly, Magic the Gathering. You can obviously watch other people play, but then by definition, you're not playing. Even narratively focused video games like The Last of Us require your participation, your input to progress. Books, stories, do not. All they require is your attention. So the question is, if we take away the participatory parts of Mio and Zoe's stories, the ones they're assumed to have written in the simulation, what do we have left? Well, in my opinion, not much. When we look closely at Mio and Zoe's internal narrative, we see interactive spaces built around unique mechanics which the characters have to utilize in order to advance. The explicit declaration in the dialogue is that these are stories. While our implicit experience is that this is obviously a non-narrative game. They might exchange some quippy dialogue from time to time, and there are moments of usually action-driven drama, but no matter how many times the characters declare, "This is my story," your cognitive dissonance affirms that you shouldn't have to be reminded. Even the Easter eggs, which presumably exist within the written works of Mio and Zoe's creations, all point towards a love of games, of game history, of a shared culture with the people who are most likely going to be experiencing split fiction. Gamers. None of the Easter eggs are about fiction, about writing, about literature, about what it means to be a writer. Now, I want to reiterate that I don't have a problem with this inherently because, again, they could simply be game devs and this issue sort of goes away without much work. But I'd like to do the work that it seems to me Hazelight intended. Let's take the idea of split fiction seriously. Now, let's start with Mio and Zoe's central conflict. That Mio writes sci-fi and Zoe writes fantasy.
Are all your stories sci-fi?
Yeah. So?
I figured. You know, I really don't understand how one can enjoy sci-fi. It's just so... depressing.
Like I'm a fan of fantasy. It is by far the most overrated and pretentious genre.
We're supposed to intuit from the game that this inherently pits them against each other, but I'll be honest, I don't really understand this choice. These genres are classically homophilic, meaning they're like birds of a feather. They go together quite well. They're two parts of a larger whole. So unless we're given a clear reason about why these two specifically hate the other's genre, which we aren't, then we have to just assume, as the audience, that this is a normal thing that happens in the world of writing. Sci-fi and fantasy are cats and dogs. They're peanut butter and mayonnaise. And yet, I've never seen a writer of fantasy who wasn't at least a peripheral fan of sci-fi, if not a writer in both genres, and vice versa. Famously, the mothers and fathers of these genres have written books in both, or at least borrowed tropes and aesthetics for creation of hybrids like science fantasy. Additionally, one of the most common pieces of advice you'll hear from seasoned authors is to read broadly in other genres, rather than just the one that you prefer to write in, so that your work doesn't end up being derivative. C.S. Lewis, Ursula K. Le Guin, Philip K. Dick, George R. R. Martin, all of these people have written in both genres. For more modern examples, we have people like Brandon Sanderson, Christopher Rocchio, V.E. Schwab, and Pierce Brown, who have all participated in the decades-old tradition of merging these genres, much like Frank Herbert with his Dune series. So these two genres are in no way conflicted. In fact, it would be more accurate to say that they're in concert, in harmony with one another. Perhaps the most famous example is Star Wars, which is often used to illustrate the difference between science fiction and fantasy. Star Wars is undoubtedly fantasy in its story, with the hero's journey, the dismissal of functional science in favor of inconsistent magic. But remove the dialogue, take away the story, just watch the screen, and it'd be reasonable to assume it was a science fiction story. Which is why it's important to understand that the distinction isn't a matter of aesthetics, but of theme and messaging. Sci-fi is not, neon lights in crumbling cities, and hackers and big computer screens. Blade Runner doesn't qualify as sci-fi because it has flying cars. It's science fiction because of its philosophies, because the central idea is about what happens when technology becomes fill in the blank. Here's how Isaac Asimov defines sci-fi in his foreword to the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction. I suppose it is a measure of the richness of the field of science fiction that no two of its practitioners are liable to agree on even something as fundamental as its definition, or on the boundaries that encompass it, and on where one draws the dividing line between itself and realistic fiction, or between itself and fantasy. What is important about science fiction, even crucial, is the very thing that gave it birth: the perception of change through technology. So the question is, does split fiction share this definition? Is Mio aware that sci-fi is contingent upon the question of what technological change produces? And I don't mean, does Mio say out loud, I write science fiction, the genre in which, I mean, do her stories telegraph in some way that she understands the genre she's supposed to be writing in? I would argue mostly no, with some minor caveats. But before we discuss those details, we should also talk about Zoe and her preferred genre of fantasy. With Zoe, we're quickly introduced to spindly houses, bubbling cauldrons, spired castles, luminescent flora, and crackling arcana. That is to say, the visual language of fantasy settings. Mio's stories get the same treatment, with bright advertisements, magnetic highways, and the ubiquity of metal and computers. The physical tropes are present. The intuitive sense that this is in fact a fantasy story is there, but unfortunately that's all there is. It's set dressing for an abandoned theater. There are so few narrative threads to pull on in these stories because there are almost no characters to interact with. This is a shame, not just because it means there are no actual stories for the player to engage with, but because the set dressing is beautiful. I mean, look at this.
Now, let's traverse the sands of time. Okay, let's try again. Okay,
It is nice to look at, and it's fun to explore. But there isn't any narrative meat to chew on. Once you've seen it, that's kind of all there is. Outside of, again, the extremely fun mechanics, which are fun, but also mostly action-oriented. Ursula K. Le Guin said in a speech about assumptions on fantasy, while fantasy can indeed be mere escapism, wish fulfillment, indulgence in empty heroics, and brainless violence, it isn't so by definition, and shouldn't be treated as if it were. Fantasy is a literature particularly useful for embodying and examining the real difference between good and evil. Good and evil aren't simply conceptual, they require action or inaction. People do these things. Apathy and cruelty are human endeavors, and in fiction, those endeavors are driven by characters. So if sci-fi is concerned with what's possible, then fantasy is concerned with the impossible. And the only way to ground a reader in an impossible world is through characters. Now, this distinction between genres will be important as we take a look at how Mio and Zoe engage with their worlds and with each other, because we're looking to establish something called verisimilitude, the quality of being real or true, of being authentic. We want the players, the audience, to believe us when we tell them, this is sci-fi, or this is fantasy. If you've ever been reading something and a character behaved in a way that seemed inconsistent, or let's say you're someone with a biology background, perhaps you see a biologist character with poor scientific understanding, this breaks your sense of verisimilitude. You can no longer believe them. And then you're just left to suspend your disbelief in order to accept the narrative, or sit uncomfortably in your cognitive dissonance. These are both bad options. The fix is to do the long, sometimes tedious work of building characters within a world, within a story. It isn't that aesthetics don't matter, they're a useful shorthand, but aesthetics are only the sinew that binds the three salient parts together: character, story, and world. And that long, tedious work starts with one question. To answer this question, we first have to ask, who are our characters? Because the story will be driven by them. Mio and Zoe, writers of sci-fi and fantasy respectively, are our protagonists. And the antagonist is J.D. Rader, head of Rader Publishing, a sort of Michael Fassbender as Steve Jobs' power fantasy, complete with black turtleneck, round frame glasses, and speeches about greatness and innovation. And then we have the technicians, Julia and Harry, who, yes, have names. Now, they have a few lines and are present on screen interacting with Raider, so we will count them as characters, but we'll come back to that in a moment. We also have 3 nameless board members who all have the same characteristics. They're stoic, irritated, and demanding. Finally, we have our 4 other nameless writers who we learn nothing about. I will not count these other writers as characters for now because they do not speak or contribute anything to the narrative or to the scenes in which they're present. So with that, we have a cast of 8 characters. This works just fine. It's not an issue to have a small cast. You can create compelling dialogue with only 2 characters and a complete narrative with 1. The problem is that the board members don't do much, and Julia and Harry, while vocal in several scenes, are not characters in the strictest sense, meaning they don't have internal motivations, agency, or even 3 dimensions. They're lab techs in white coats who work with the machine, and that's all we learn about them.
What is going on?
It's those glitches, sir. They seem to be finding more of them.
If they were to spread into the mainframe, it could jeopardize the entire machine.
Okay, that's it then. Let's just cut our losses and shut their extraction down, get them out.
Yes, sir.
Right away.
I think for our purposes, it's probably more accurate to just say there are 3 characters in Split Fiction: Zoe, Mio, and Raider. So having established who the drivers of the plot are, what then is the story between them? Now, if we're asking what the external story is about, it's definitely Mio and Zoe versus Raider and his machine. More broadly, it's about the sort of moral import of genuine creativity over stolen, recycled artwork, creatives versus money, ideas versus theft, artists versus AI is probably the closest correlation, though we don't land specifically in any one of these camps, and the game sort of orbits around these broad ideas. I think this works fine. Also funny to note, this is a sci-fi story. The advancement of technology and the changes that are possible and the consequences of those changes where corrupt hands are in control, neither here nor there. But that's only the external arc, which is much shorter, much smaller than the one happening within the world of the machine, where 90% of the game takes place. Inside the simulation, Mio and Zoe's stories are the catalysts for their internal character arcs. Now, personally, I think that this is some of the strongest work in Split Fiction. We can see their characteristics through dialogue and behavior. We're shown instead of told. The arc of these characters also makes sense. Zoe starts as overly sincere, caring, pretends to wear her heart on her sleeve, but by the end learns the importance of grief, of contending with the slow, cyclical pain of acceptance. That speaking your loss out loud isn't the thing that makes it true. That, in fact, that's where you can begin to heal. Mio starts out cold and laconic. She's an icebox with a frozen padlock, dismissive and brutish. But she learns the benefit of letting people in is worth the risk, that the whole world isn't her enemy, and that asking for support isn't a weakness, but a strength. In truth, they need each other. This arc works. In concept. In execution, I think it lacks the punch of the genuine article, and I think what's missing from the contention between them is something obviously true, so that when the conclusion of their arcs are fulfilled, the players see the trajectory and have that aha, of course moment. Anything less than an emotional haymaker, that risk of taking a big swing, and will never achieve the ambitious payoff this game is promising with its setup. We want catharsis. First, if the story is about Mio and Zoe versus Raider and his machine externally, and the internal drama is about Mio and Zoe learning to open up, to be honest and vulnerable, then we have to connect these threads with an implicit contention. The sci-fi fantasy thing is just too esoteric. We need something more universally relatable, something that people outside the industry will understand and people inside the industry will respect. If we're going to honor the title of Split Fiction, I think the obvious tension here is between published versus unpublished, venerated members of the institution and the hopeless hopefuls. A bit of ego is always necessary to cultivate creative work, but it's also the same garden from which imposter syndrome sprouts, the unjustified idea that you're a fraud, and people will eventually find out. It's the sense that you're simply fooling everyone, that you're wearing a mask. But imposter syndrome is the lie. If you're doing the thing already, then you're doing the thing. You can't both be an imposter and be capable of doing what you're doing. So then why do we doubt when we're in a situation like that? Well, I'd argue we doubt because we care. We want to be good. That's ego. But it isn't a bad thing if we keep it in check. It's relatable. It's also cultural. And it certainly makes the rounds in the writerly parlance. Even to people outside the field of novel writing, they can understand what it feels like to be a fraud, to feel like they don't belong, to feel ostracized. But especially in the world of publishing, where unpublished authors outweigh published authors by about 95 to 98%, it's pretty easy to doubt. So we now have a brightly lit stage for our characters' conflict, easy to see even from the nosebleeds. It also means we can actually keep a lot of the original characterization intact because, again, I do think that's some of the strongest, most coherent work in the original script, and this is a collaborative process, so we're not trying to destroy, we're trying to build. But we are going to try and make some shifts as well. Now, in this battle between the published and the unpublished, I think the more compelling flaws to emphasize are insecurity and lack of self-awareness. We'll use Mio's unpublished status as fertile ground for her insecurity, especially because she already seems to be cynical, impersonal, bad with people. She's kind of mean and unwilling to take criticism. This could make her bitter about her circumstances, even if justifiably. Maybe she sees the unpublished status as another example of the unfair system working as intended, suppressing her creativity, stealing opportunities. There's some narrative interplay there with her father not getting the care he deserves and being put through the ringer of an oppressive medical system. They've both been beaten down, and Mio sees the world as her enemy, as a thing to fight, to defeat. Insecurity and doubt masquerading as strength. As someone who spent a lot of time in the US healthcare system, I wish that was all of it. I'm telling you, it isn't unreasonable to come out the other end of that meat grinder with more than a hint of bitterness and to feel like you're always sort of hanging on the edge of a cliff. Because the other problem is, if you can't manage the financial requirements for care, at least here in the US, the system is wholly indifferent about spitting you out like an overchewed piece of gum. It steals from you money, time, peace. And now we have Mio at Raider, a corporation she probably hates, who is stealing ideas to help pay for her father's treatments. So we have some self-sacrifice here, a neglect of her ethics in favor of her father's health. This is a good dilemma. It's also easy enough to relate to for a lot of people, again, especially people here in the United States. Zoe couldn't be a more perfect foil for Mio. She's highly extroverted, bubbly and sincere, happy to be wherever she is. She has an immovable spirit and a zest for life. But this can also make her unaware of what's going on around her, assuming everyone is as happy and content as she is, that getting published really isn't that challenging. We can imagine this causing conflicts in external relationships, but more importantly, this emphasizes the focus on her internal conflict, the death of her twin sister. It's a meaningful corollary for people with attention deficit disorders and parallel neurodivergencies who might miss important details due to no fault of their own. But even when something isn't our fault, it doesn't mean we don't blame ourselves, especially when the consequences are dire. Zoe, distracted by her zest for life, only looked away for a second. However, her bubbly personality has served her well in finding an agent and getting published. Just not the stories she expected. Her romantasy novels are doing quite well with readers, but she can't seem to get her high fantasy ideas published. So she's here today at Raider to try and revive her rejected fantasy trilogy. This isn't a far cry from where we started. Again, writing a game like this is collaborative, so we want to buttress the original framing of the narrative wherever possible until we find something that actually needs to be rebuilt. Let's go back to the scene in the elevator where we're introduced to our protagonists and consider how we change it to reflect this version of the story.
Wait, hold the door! Whew, that was close. Hi. Excuse me? Can I ask you something? Have you been published before?
Nope.
No, me neither. Whew. My parents always say I should quit writing and get a real job, but look at me now. So what's your story about?
It's science fiction.
Oh, sci-fi. Sci-fi's cool. I write fantasy.
Look, I don't mean to be rude and all, but I really don't do small talk.
Oh, Okay. Nice to meet you too.
Now, what we'd like to do in this scene is draw out the flaws of insecurity and lack of self-awareness so that these are established right at the top. Additionally, we want to see the seeds of their new conflict play out, published versus unpublished. We'll rely a bit more on inference through behavior by giving our actors subtext in the action lines. Our version starts the same, with Zoe yelling out, "Wait, hold the door." Mio makes no attempt to hold the elevator, as Zoe barrels through the door with a smile. She says that was close. Mio says nothing. Zoe smiles obliviously, bubbling with energy. "Is this your first time?" Zoe asks. Mio slowly nods. There's a pause as Zoe practices what she's been taught, to wait for someone else to speak before going on about her special interests. Zoe says, "My agent told me not to come." Mio appraises Zoe with a side eye at the sound of the word agent. She has an agent? Has she been published? Zoe does her best impression of her agent's Southern American accent. She said, "Raiders just 3 rich kids in a turtleneck trench coat." But she won't publish my fantasy series, so you know the gig. Oh, don't tell Raider she said that. I wasn't supposed to mention it. Zoe waits again, trying to make eye contact, but Mio doesn't respond. Zoe remembers she should always ask a question after sharing something about herself. "Oh, so what's your story about?" A pause. Of all the things Mio could actually talk about, her book is a good start. Reluctantly, Mio says, "It's science fiction about..." Zoe gets giddy before Mio can even finish her thought. "I love sci-fi," Zoe says. "My copy of Ender's Game is practically in tatters. Is yours speculative? Space opera? Wait, don't tell me. I don't want to spoil it." Mio continues to give social signals that she's uninterested in talking, shifting her weight, looking away, sighing, but Zoe smiles through the whole exchange and is otherwise cordial and friendly. Zoe says, "I haven't written sci-fi yet. Romantasy currently pays the bills, but lately I've been feeling like my other ideas are good too." Mio not so subtly rolls her eyes at the mention of romantasy. She sees the genre as lesser than. Zoe is not getting the hint. Zoe says, "Like, there's this one I have about dragons. It's sort of a play on..." Mio interrupts her, saying, "Can we just ride in silence? I want to focus." Mio is trying her level best not to be mean, but her nerve endings are already so exposed being inside a building that represents everything she hates about publishing. Zoe's suddenly aware of her oversharing. She becomes self-conscious. She replays the encounter in her head. What did she do wrong this time? Zoe says, sincerely, "Oh, right, sorry." Zoe recognizes this feeling. She's been here before, having done too much too quickly, not read the signs, but she can't pinpoint it. The two of them share a moment of Zoe's most hated social interaction and Mio's go-to, awkward silence, before the doors open and Mio rushes out ahead of Zoe. Zoe pauses in the elevator, rehearsing perhaps what she should have said. "What's your sci-fi story about?" So here we see Mio is jealous, but she doesn't see it that way. She sees it with a sense of right and wrong. This is unjust, she might think. Zoe doesn't deserve her success. She doesn't know what it's like to not succeed. Her ideas are probably as vapid and small as she is. Romantasy is for weirdos and perverts. These aren't words we put into the script, but rather into the subtext. We rely on our performers, and this is important when you're working in visual media. Writing isn't the whole job. These words are what Mio's feeling, but people rarely say precisely what they're thinking, especially to strangers. So we need to exposit this to the audience through Mio's behavior and in the lines between. For Zoe, we needed a display of her going on and on and on about how excited she is with her special interest in fantasy, talking about her published novels as if they're behind her, perhaps even that it wasn't all that difficult. We should see a constant need for her to remind herself to think about other people. She isn't unkind, just unaware. Now this scene tells the players most of what they need to know moving forward. These two are writers. One is published and cavalier about it, though sweet and clearly a nice person. The other is unpublished, perhaps jealous, but also sharp. The conflict emerges as a consequence of circumstance. It's about hierarchy. Zoe is in a position Mio wants to be in, and Mio, a poor communicator, can't get Zoe to understand her. They don't know each other. Yet. They'll learn to over the course of their stories, just as it is in the original split fiction. But what are their stories actually about? Since we haven't rewritten the entire script, only Act 1, We'll just be giving developmental ideas about later acts and on how they connect to the primary stories and our character's arc, so that we can achieve that catharsis and verisimilitude we were talking about before. We have a total of 4 primary stories, 2 each, with an additional story each at the end that works as a subconscious rendering of the internal conflicts that had been hinted at. I love this, by the way. This is one of my favorite parts of the whole game, so hats off to the writers for this idea. But I do think there's even more that we can do, especially involving the other writers who've, up to this point, had nothing to do. So we'll come back to this in a moment. After that, there's a final chapter which acts as an amalgam of the mechanical features the game has introduced thus far, and that's our timeline of the simulated world in Split Fiction. So, first up we have Neon Revenge, which Mio describes as...
It's very simple and straightforward. We are cyber ninjas hunting down the boss of the SRI crime syndicate.
Again, if we remove all of the visual elements, what do we actually have here in terms of narrative? Well, we have the SRI crime boss who acts...
I decide when your shit is paid. And until the mortgage is secured, your ass belongs to me.
What is she talking about, Mio?
No, don't mind her. I just wrote her as a flat, greedy villain.
We also have the parking attendant, who is less of a character and more of an obstacle, which is fine. There isn't really a connection, though, here, besides the assumption that maybe Mio has unpaid parking tickets and the SRI crime boss is concerned about that. Her connection to the crime boss isn't much clearer. I've watched this through several times, and the only specificity we get as to what the revenge story is about is something related to a mortgage, possibly. The line could also be read as a metaphor, so I'm not even entirely confident that that's what we're supposed to infer from this interaction. And that's it. There are plenty of other bits of dialogue, but almost none of them are connected to this central idea, which, in the most charitable reading, is a revenge story where Mio is meant to find and kill a crime boss who did something to her. Zoe inundates Mio with questions about this story. What is it about? What does it mean? What is the inspiration? And Mio's responses are relatively sparse with context, though that's only a problem if it isn't intentional. Showing us Mio's reluctance to open up is a choice. Still, some of the responses are odd even with that consideration.
Okay, what's it about?
Revenge.
Repayment? What is the inspiration behind this story, Mio?
Now, Zoe.
But surely all this action and killing must come from something.
You know what, Zoe? Let's stay here and find the root for it all, shall we? I feel like I'm ready to do some serious soul searching right here, right now.
Can I ask you something? What's with all the debts and payments in this story?
What do you mean?
I'm just curious as to what the story's about.
I told you it's a revenge story.
That part I got, trust me. But what's it really about?
Nothing.
Oh, come on. You always put a bit of yourself into what you create.
I don't think that's true.
To fix this, we need a through line. What is this story actually about? This is where some of that rebuilding needs to happen. Calling it a cyberpunk revenge story does give us a clue as to what the writers intended, so let's follow that first breadcrumb. Typically, revenge requires motivation, a strong one, usually something that stems from pain or loss. But if we want to follow Zoe's insistence that Mio's stories are directly motivated by her real-life experience, then let's plant that seed here at the start. We'll be intending to cultivate that idea with every subsequent story as well, but this is the beginning. Given her relationship with her father, I think the simplest connection is that in this story, Neon Revenge, instead of Mio owing money, it should be someone her character loves is in debt to the SRI, and the crime boss ordered his abduction and is ransoming his friends and family to pay. If they can't come up with the money in 2 days, the crime boss will kill him. Simple. Mio finds out and is going after the crime boss who has been extorting the poor for decades, giving us reasons to hate this person. This is also a direct analog to the way medicine in the US works. If you stop paying, they'll just let you die, and the first to die are usually the poorest. But there's just enough distance here from Mio's real-life father situation to save us from being too on the nose. Really early on, we want questions, not answers. Just remember that intrigue is a promise, not a story in and of itself, so we do need to fulfill that payoff. This will work for the purposes of Mio's motivation for revenge, but it doesn't explain why she and Zoe are cyber ninjas. Simplest fix to this is to just add some over-ear communication from a perceived rebel cell that perhaps the women are a part of. Maybe Mio's character has gone rogue and Zoe is her sister or her lover or a ninja from the same cell tagging along to assist. We'll need more details later, but for now we're just concerned with establishing something that actually connects these two to the world and makes it feel lived in and alive. That it doesn't require the main characters to be present, to be active and kinetic. Right now, if you remove Mio and Zoe from the world of the game, it becomes an unshaken snow globe. Silent, full of potential, but ultimately motionless. We need it moving or it feels dead, and it needs to do this by itself. And that includes the secondary and tertiary antagonists as well. Anyone who stands in opposition to Mio and Zoe's goal should have an express reason to be there. If they wear the SRI logo, we should know what they're about. The sub-bosses of Neon Revenge need to be more closely related to the final boss, with dialogue that points toward the inevitable confrontation with the SRI crime boss, that points to previous encounters that they've had, a shared fiction. Easy enough to make Mr. Hammer and the parking attendant enforcers of the syndicate.
Say hello to Mr. Hammer.
Hello, Mr. Hammer.
You have unpaid parking tickets. Time to die.
Excuse me? Run!
But that should be threaded into the story. Perhaps Mr. Hammer is the one who broke her sensei's legs when he didn't pay. Maybe the parking attendant is the oppressive eye of the crime boss who abducted her sensei. It doesn't have to be that necessarily, but something. Anything that hitches their wagons together is enough. We also need a name for the crime boss. Crime boss is just a bit too generic, and we will get into more of the generic naming conventions a little bit later. But for now, we need a first name that feels imposing. Something with plosive consonants, some K's and P's and G's and T's. Now, I picked Katarina because it feels strong and meets our other criteria. Last name isn't always necessary, but I think this character calls for a surname so that we know Mio's character has a deep familiarity. We want something that gives a sense of tightening the noose. Given that the cyberpunk world is called Neon Revenge, I thought maybe some kind of periodic element, a gas like neon, could work, but I thought Katarina Neon was a bit too obvious, and Katarina Krypton, another gaseous element, sounds like a DC character. I liked the elements Argon and Radon as last names, but Radon sounded too much like Raider. Argon, however, is an asphyxiant gas, so it will literally suffocate you to death. And it's also known as the lazy element, which I learned from some research. It's non-reactive, inert to other substances. This gives us some really interesting characteristics to play with when we get to Katarina's dialogue. Katarina Argon. It feels good enough for now, though under normal circumstances, this is definitely something that we would iterate on for a while in collaboration with the other writers. Now, you might be wondering why we're taking so much time on a name, especially since the player will never know the meaning behind these words. It's because these are the kinds of details players feel. I'm of the opinion that Mio and Zoe are good names. They work for the characters because they come from a thoughtful place. Mio and Zoe are actually Joseph Fares's daughters, the head of the studio. He certainly didn't come up with these names on a whim. If you're taking slow care with the little things, that same attention to detail will inevitably cascade down across the larger set pieces, and the players will sense this. Conversely, if you call this device the machine, capital T, capital M, it assumes an apathy about details. And if the player assumes this kind of apathy, they'll be less receptive to complexity moving forward. Personally, when I saw this was called the machine, and she was called the crime boss, and this was called the Ice King, etc., these all felt like the shortest distance between an initial concept and a finalized one. A straight line from the first idea to the published version without iteration. I sort of turned my brain off and accepted that the narrative wasn't going to be fastidious with detail. Now, that's not always bad. I've played games that, play it a little bit fast and loose with the detail, and they work just fine, given the context of those games. But again, in a game called Split Fiction, where we're talking specifically about novelists, I think details matter. Now, a related issue, Mio and Zoe as characters in Neon Revenge are never explained. Who are they? What are their names? How do they know each other? We just know that they're cyber ninjas, a term which is perfectly fine to leave somewhat vague. I think the aesthetics of cyberpunk are doing that shorthand work we mentioned earlier, and ninja presents a specific enough connotation that we can make inferences about what they mean, even if we're not in feudal Japan. Now, we don't have time to get into the historical accuracy of whether or not ninjas were actually assassins, so forgive the looseness of just accepting that misunderstanding at face value. We have to move on. But for now, we just need to know how cyber ninja assassins would be connected to the world. Are they rogue individuals, part of a faction or cell like we mentioned earlier, a clan, a clandestine group of hackers? Any of these will work, but we'll go with the cell because I think that forces us to world build and take a look at the scene as they first enter the world of Neon Revenge.
Okay, Mio. Where are we?
They really are stealing our ideas.
So this isn't the story you submitted?
No. I wrote this a couple years ago.
Okay. What's it about?
Revenge.
Revenge? Well, that sounds dangerous. And what is this?
Careful!
Whoa!
It's a gravity whip!
What are you doing up there? Ugh. What kind of a revenge story is this?
It's very simple and straightforward. We are cyber ninjas hunting down the boss of the SRI crime syndicate.
In what world is any of that simple?
Let's just go through the story and find the glitch, okay?
I'm gonna lose my mind.
As mentioned, the missing factors from all of these stories are characters. So we want to be thoughtful right at the top about establishing a character-driven narrative. We need a reason for Mio and Zoe to exist in this world, and we need an obvious plot to drive them forward. We also want to clue the audience into some hidden details about Mio, that she does have a fun side, but she takes her fun seriously. We also want to give Mio the benefit of the doubt, since this is her first primary story. It's a good opportunity to prove that she's a strong enough writer to withhold details for dramatic effect. So instead of Zoe saying, "Revenge sounds dangerous," I think she should be intrigued. She says, "Vague but intriguing." Zoe looks herself over, admiring the suit. She says, "And who am I in this gritty underworld?" A digital chirp beeps in Mio and Zoe's ear as Chiyome's voice, the leader of their cyber ninja cell, speaks. Chiyome says, "I'm asking you not to do this." Mio eyes Zoe, realizing she'll have to commit in character in order to progress the story. Mio says to Chiyome, "I didn't have a choice." Chiyome says, "We can find the money. We'll figure it out together." Mio says, "No, this is happening, Chiyome. Either get on board or get out of my ear." A pause of static on the other end. Zoe is vibrating with excited energy as she watches Mio play out her role. A sigh from the other end of the communication device. Chiyome says, "What do you need?" Mio says, "Intel, the location of Katarina's lieutenant. A man with a hammer showed up outside Sensei's apartment. It has to be him." Chiyome says, "We're looking into it." There's a pause. Shiori, "Is Miko with you?" Mio glances sidelong at Zoe. "Let us know when you have something," Mio says in response. Mio presses her finger behind her ear, and the call with Chiyome ends. Zoe's mouth is agape. Zoe says, "Mio, that was electric. Oh my god, I have so many questions. Is Chiyome our ninja leader? Who's Miko? Is that me? Are we sisters? Lovers?" And then she notices the gravity whip on her side. "And what's this thing?" Zoe pushes a button on the energy baton, which sizzles and extends with energy as a gravity whip, which can grab objects to manipulate or throw them. She grabs a barrel and lobs it past both their heads by accident. Mio flips backwards, using her gravity katana to swing up to the ceiling out of the way. Mio says, "Careful." Zoe says, "Whoa." Mio, from the ceiling, says, "It's a gravity whip." Zoe says, "Blades and whips, huh? Romantasy is calling." Mio expertly throws her katana at the floor next to Zoe. Threads of energy connect her suit to the sword, and she flips from the ceiling to land next to the blade. Mio says, "Don't be gross. This is a revenge story. And yes, you're playing Miko. No, they're not lovers. Or maybe. I don't know. I hadn't figured that part out yet." Zoe takes a deep breath in through her nose. The smell of an unfinished draft. So many possibilities. Ooh, maybe we can figure it out together. Mio hates this idea. She thinks Zoe could never understand the depth of a painful revenge story, that she's probably never understood what it feels like to lose someone. Mio says, Let's just go through the story and find the glitch. Zoe, exasperated, says, "Okay, but don't get mad if I have ideas." My partner noticed something interesting in that last part of the video, something that had completely ducked my radar, which is that Zoe's character in Neon Revenge I named Miko, despite the fact that she's standing right next to a character in Split Fiction named Mio. Now, I can't explain why this oversight happened other than the fact that maybe I was nose deep in research about Japanese historical figures trying to find names that were relevant to the characters. But this seems like a really obvious oversight, especially if Mio is supposed to be a self-insert in all of her stories. It seems obvious that we should give Mio the name that's closer to her own name. But I just wanted to pinpoint this here, that nobody's going to get this stuff 100% right, which is why collaboration is so important. If I were working on the team at Hazelight, I can almost guarantee that either Sebastian or Joseph or whoever else is on the writing team would notice this. We need each other. Now, Mio will go on to explain Zoe's role, that she's the daughter of the cell leader, a young, inexperienced ninja in love with Mio's character. Against their best interest and the advice of their leader, they're going after Katarina Argon all by themselves. The two of them are off-grid. But this voice in their ear connects them to the world. And Chiome can cut in at any time to add tension or punctuate moments, allowing for more natural dialogue amid the platforming and action sequences, allowing a story to emerge. Mio can explain the story to Zoe as they go, what obstacles they'll have to overcome, what their goals are, what the story means. Now, Zoe will eventually join in with the same enthusiasm, eager to play her part and experience the story that Mio has written. Because again, she's a writer. She's trying to be as faithful as she can to what Mio tells her story is about and who her character is. But more importantly, moving forward, we now have a story that Mio can use to talk about her writing process. Remember, these are writers. This is what this game is about. Now, Zoe already has so many questions, but the ones Mio chooses to answer will tell us just as much as the ones she doesn't, about what kind of person she is, what she cares about, why she writes about the subject matter in her stories. This also helps orient the player as to what Mio and Zoe's ultimate goal is in this first story, Neon Revenge. Finding and killing Katarina Argon and rescuing Shiori's sensei, a fatherly figure in dire straits who is reliant upon Shiori to rescue him. Now, to those of you who have already played the game, this parallel here is obvious, but it should act as a plot twist when we meet the giant squid beast later on. And I do mean plot twist in the classical literal definition, that is, a twisting of the plot that subverts our understanding of previous scenes, like with the reveal at the end of The Sixth Sense or Planet of the Apes. So learning that Mio is writing stories in which her self-insert character can save her father figure is something we don't need to say out loud. The player is smart enough to infer this. And when Raider asks Mio about her father and their need for money and medical care, this is more than enough of a telegraph. I would argue we could even do less, more inference in this scene.
Be able to assist you with your father's situation. We looked you up. And if it's financial assistance you require, I might be able to help you.
You could?
Yes. And all you have to do in return is stop pursuing the glitches. Isn't that why you came here in the first place? To get paid? What if I told you that we could get rid of all your problems today?
In the current iteration of the game, we have a total of 3 moments seeing the crime boss, as she's named. I actually think this is great, less is more. We're drip-fed information about her dynamic with Mio, so she feels like more of a looming problem with her enforcers around every corner doing the grunt work, and the ultimate showdown feels like an inevitability. The problem is that these scenes feel disconnected from everything else we're doing, and when we finally meet the crime boss, she's not actually threatening, because there are no stakes.
When you control the money like we do, you control it all! Now, witness the unstoppable might of the SRI!
Get ready. She drives a tank.
A what now?
A tank.
Check out my most luxurious toy!
Mechanically speaking, we can't die, so there's no threat there. We need something to lose, something to care about. Now, the obvious answer in our version is Mio's sensei, but there's also the voice in our ear. Just before the final fight, I think Katarina could reveal that she has one of them in custody, perhaps is even hanging them from chains in the radio tower atop the SRI building. It's something to see and a person to save. It's a connection. With our version, we're trying to make it as clear as possible. Katarina Argon has stolen Mio's character's sensei, the person who taught her how to be a cyber ninja, whatever that means, it's not totally relevant. And they need to rescue him and defeat Katarina Argon. Now that we have a clearer picture of the first simulation story and how we would functionally change the others using the same methods of iteration, detail, character expansion, and narrative thread connection, we should just talk for a moment about dialogue in general. There's no other way to say it than this script just needs a line editing pass. It needs punch up for the comedy, a toning down of some of the overwriting, removals or rewrites for any of the kind of cringy lines, and a tightening up of the character-to-character interactions. We need more focus on subtextual dialogue, those things that are obvious to the viewer but never spoken aloud. Too much of the script, I'd argue, is explicitly said to us, and it can sometimes feel like we're being told what to think and what to feel, so we need to make some space. We also need to trust our actors more. Reliance on performance and on music when you're working in a visual medium is not lazy writing, it's confident writing. Trust that the audience will understand. I like to use two scenes from other sources as references for how we'd approach something like this. First is a scene from The Last of Us in which Joel says goodbye to Bill, or rather, doesn't.
All right, this'll do! Stop!
Just keep it running, all right?
That girl nearly got us killed.
You gotta admit, she did hold her own back there.
You ain't gonna make it. Here.
What's this?
You'd be amazed at how many cars still got gas in them.
Appreciate it. Look, Bill, about your buddy back there, that's a tough deal. And
We square?
we're square.
And get the fuck out of my town.
Next is a scene from Andor in which the titular character meets a mysterious man named Luthen. These are two highly suspicious characters who know very little of one another, risking everything to meet under deadly threat of Empire persecution.
Andor? You made it. Are we alone? I am. How much?
40,000.
40,000.
40,000 credits is cheap.
Is it?
An untraceable star path unit. Vector crystals, unsealed, still intact. You can track every Imperial coordinate for 9 radial parsecs.
Is it here?
Is the money here?
How do I know it works?
It's sealed. The moment I plug it in, the value drops.
So you could be scamming me.
I'm giving you my word.
But if that's not enough?
You know where I live?
So I could come back if I were dissatisfied.
Has Biggs ever burned you before?
You're planning on sticking around, are you?
Now, I want to make it as clear as possible. It isn't important what's said in these scenes. It's important what isn't. In the Andor scene, the number of questions asked in 1 minute is 13. That's one question every approximately 4.6 seconds. The number of direct answers to those questions is 1. Luthen asks how much, and Andor answers 40,000. Every other answer to every other question is either a dodge or another question. So why are these scenes relevant to split fiction? Well, they both manage to achieve one of the most difficult things for a writer, and I'll admit that on my part. Restraint. We're told a lot by what isn't said. We're given emotion, not information. Their reactions tell us everything and invite us to speculate. to wonder. Now, this doesn't work for every story, but with split fiction, we have two characters who don't know or trust one another, who are being cagey with information and reluctant with their true emotions. Restraint is how we get Mio and Zoe to sound less like actors reading a script and more like two people having a conversation. We do this by just simply having them say less. And I don't mean that we give them fewer lines, but that the lines we do give them aren't so explicit about what they mean. We need to infer. You'd be surprised how much the audience can pick up on by inference. Joel said very little in that scene with Bill, but in the space where those things didn't get said, there's a whole world of imagined conversations. If we don't leave room for the imagination of our players, then we're robbing them of the better game that exists in their head, in the subtext. Say enough and then get out of the way of the performance, the music, the visuals. The instinct to explain isn't the wrong one, but execution is everything. We want the players to understand what's going on, but we don't want to eliminate a sense of mystery. If there isn't a question pulling at the edges of their subconscious, compelling them to play on, then we failed in our narrative goal. Let's take this scene where Mio finally reveals to Zoe that her stories are about her father. Let's try to pull back to deliver the same information by saying less, by revealing emotion instead of information.
This is it. Is that creature the source of the toxins?
This is where the mechs keep him.
Him?
They captured and tortured him to siphon his lifeblood.
That poor thing.
Yeah. You probably already guessed it, but I sort of based the story around my dad. Ever since he got diagnosed, all these visits to the hospitals, medicines, treatments. It doesn't matter what we try, it just keeps on spreading. Seems like all we can do now is wait for the inevitable. It might be tomorrow, next month, 6 months, who knows?
Are you alone in all of this? What about your mother? Your family?
It has always just been me and my dad.
I'm sorry.
All I can do is write this silly story where I get to save him. Like it would change anything.
No one should have to go through that. Much less alone.
I don't want to stay here, Zoe. I want to leave.
Then let's do that.
I just want to say, the pan over to Zoe asking if she's alone in this is a really nice piece of directing, especially with the confirmation from Mio that it's only ever been her and her dad, but we see Zoe behind her as support. That's, honestly will make me tear up. Sometimes it is enough to just say outright, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm feeling. You don't always want to say less. However, because this isn't the culmination of Mio's arc, and we still have one more story to work through, I'd like to have Mio talk around the point a bit more. I'd like for her to invite Zoe to speculate, to hope she'll figure out what Mio means, as if to suggest it would lessen the blow to have someone else take on the burden of saying it out loud. We can imagine Mio's had to talk about her dad's cancer a lot over the years, so instead, here, she talks about her experience. Importantly for Zoe, she's been asking constantly for the inspiration for all of these stories up till now. But in this moment, as she's looking at the creature, to give her a bit of character growth, I think it's important that she give Mio the space to explain, that she practices some self-awareness and makes an effort to pay attention. Our version starts quite similarly, but we have Mio speak quite a bit less. Here, Mio is quieter than normal as they look on. Zoe, instead of asking a question, says, "The source of the toxins, I'm guessing." Mio doesn't answer, but she doesn't argue either. Zoe has spent enough time in Mio's stories to have a firm grasp on her narrative choices. The two women approach slowly. The creature is many times their size, but is quiet, sad, won't even look at them directly. It's been broken. Zoe says, "That poor thing." The creature warbles a melancholic groan. Mio says, "You gonna ask about him? What the inspiration was?" Zoe watches the creature, looking on sympathetically. She knows the inspiration, even if the details are lost on her. "Do you want me to ask?" Both of them are staring into the one large, sad eye of the squid creature. There's a long, quiet pause in which Mio tries to figure out what to say. Mio looks around the room, studying the machinery, the floor. She runs her hand along the railing, taking in every detail of her rendered imagination. It's all there. "I've become an expert on things I don't want to know." She pauses. Like, Mercy Medical is 19 minutes from our house. Not 20, 19. Zoe looks over at Mio, who's staring at her feet. "I also know it's better to take the stairs to the oncology ward, because the service elevator goes out all the time. I know they don't have a coffee machine up there because the smell is nauseating for chemo patients, so you have to sneak down to the inpatient unit for a cup, and it's a lot of late nights." Mio's trying not to break. Zoe looks back up at the creature and puts two and two together. "Your dad?" Mio says, "Stage 2. She laughs sarcastically. "It's even treatable, but..." Zoe says, "You can't afford it." Mio says, "This was his chance. Would have paid for the next few treatments." Zoe says, "Are you alone? Any family? Your mother?" Mio shakes her head, looks up at the creature. "Just me and him. Always has been." Zoe says, "I'm sorry." Mio says, "You probably think it's pathetic, writing these silly stories where I get to save him." Zoe says, "I think it's courageous, and I think there's a reason you always write someone to help you in these stories." Mio catches eyes with Zoe. Zoe smiles softly. Zoe says, "No one should have to go it alone." Mio bites her lip to keep it all from spilling out. She looks back at the creature. "Help me get him out?" When Zoe doesn't say anything, Mio looks back at her, and Zoe is already at the terminal, ready to push the button to free the creature. Frank Capra said of filmmaking, "I made mistakes in drama. I thought drama was when actors cried, but drama is when the audience cries. This is the effect of restraint." The problem I have with Raider is that, despite being an analog for other tech billionaires, he seems to be, as far as I can tell, an actual genius. It's never questioned whether or not he did invent this amazing machine. He repeatedly says, "my machine" and "my life's work," but there's never a correction or so much as a glance sidelong at this claim. Even with the most charitable read, Raider did do the work, and the biggest problem is that this means he's a creative, just like the writers, but his machine is about stealing creativity. There's even a board of nameless, faceless people who we can't possibly relate with getting in Raider's way. Are they the real bad guys? In some ways, you might even be able to paint Raider as a victim of oversight. If only he was given the freedom to pursue this project without constraint, who knows what he could have accomplished? This presents an obvious problem, which doesn't get addressed. Raider is only a projected villain. He looks imposing and frightening and cruel, like the Wizard of Oz, but run your hand through his motivations, and he's ultimately hollow. He is stealing their ideas, and he's willing to let Mio and Zoe die to save his machine. Sure, that's evil, but why? Why is he stealing these ideas?
Can't you see that I'm doing society a favor? I'm the good guy here.
I seriously doubt that.
What you're witnessing down there is but a taste of what my machine can do. I will change the entire industry. I just need to gather enough stories, and my machine will be fully operational.
By stealing them?
I'm not surprised that you narrow-minded amateurs can't comprehend the majesty of what I'm trying to achieve here.
What? All I see is another big corporation screwing over the little guy.
Yeah, how original.
It doesn't matter what you think. All you have to do now is sit tight and witness as I fully restore my machine and put an end to your insignificant little uprising.
It seems like such a massive, unnecessary risk to steal their stories instead of just publishing them. These people also signed in at this company, presumably, all of these writers. They have documented evidence of their invitation to Raider Publishing. Moreover, at another point, Raider says thousands of minds.
It's not about ideas. Ideas are easy, everybody has them. We're extracting creativity from thousands of minds, all working for us to create masterpieces that you can live, touch, feel.
So is he intending to steal ideas from everyone? Has he already been stealing ideas? We have very little context for what our timeline looks like and what the end goal is. It's not enough to imply a philosophical alignment with stealing ideas is bad. We also need details about what this is all about. What were the writers told before they arrived? What was in the invitation they received? It sounds like they were told their work was going to be published, and then they arrived and were told to undress and put on haptic suits.
Do we get to wear these?
Yes, the suits will help us pinpoint and track your synchronization.
Track and synchronize what?
Mr. Raider will fill you in on the details shortly.
This would be very weird if they didn't know this expectation beforehand, yet Mio only seems uncomfortable with this or surprised by it when Raider tells them what they'll be doing.
You will all undergo a unique simulation of your story. And during the experience, we will record and store it all, and then package and publish. Welcome to the next chapter of storytelling. Yes.
Hi. Hey, I'm Zoe. Sounds amazing. I just wanted to thank you for giving us this opportunity to get published. Lord knows it is rough being an unpublished writer these days, am I right?
Are you saying that we're gonna be plugged into that machine?
But was none of this in the invitation? Did they apply or were they found? All of these details would be less important if we just had a bit of clarity on one thing. Why is Raider the creator of the machine and not just the face of the company?
This is my machine. I've spent 20 years of my life building it, and no one is going to take it away from me. Nobody!
It's already happened.
How can you all be so short-sighted? We're this close to completing my machine. When we go live, we'll dominate the entire market!
We've already dispatched the team to take over.
No!
They're on their way as we speak.
You three can go to hell!
This is not the administrative work of a billion-dollar company concerned with protecting their bottom line. It's the messy work of an incompetent billionaire who thinks he's more important than everyone else. This gets back to the question of what this story is actually about. If it's a one-to-one proxy for AI and idea theft, then we have to point out the problem with AI as it pertains to the raiders of the world. It isn't just about stealing ideas. It's also about the claim that the people using AI are artists themselves. It's about the diminishment of creative work as just something that's generated sort of ethereally. You know, the years of practice, the precious spending of limited time to improve. These things are meaningless and do not contribute to what makes art art. It isn't about meaning, it's about aesthetics. This is the way they think. Prompting an AI to amalgamate an image out of stolen artwork makes you an artist the same way asking someone to paint you a picture makes you an artist. You're not the artist in either scenario. You're just a guy asking someone else to do it. This is the problem with Raider. He cannot be a creative if he's also in the position of the thief. Our solution to this is Julia and Harry.
Can't we stop them?
We don't know yet, but we need to find a solution before the machine takes damage.
Damn it. What's the status of the other participants?
All stable. The machine is fully operational and is successfully extracting all of their ideas.
Except these two.
Just have them be the true creators of the machine. Two people who passionately believed in the idea of democratizing publishing, of bringing stories to life, of helping unpublished people share their work in a novel way. We have, by the way, a black man and a white woman in STEM, two famously underrepresented groups. This presents an opportunity to have something to say. We do this through character action. However, like I previously mentioned, Julia and Harry, as they are in the game, are non-characters. They don't have much to do or say, and I don't know what motivates them. Obviously, they work at Raider and have for some time. They also have a working relationship with the man, but they say very little in moral defense of what's happening and in regard to the participants until the very end when we're talking about murder.
It's working. The repair protocol is active.
Sir, their vitals are dropping and fast.
Just keep your focus on restoring the machine.
But we're about to render them brain dead.
The only thing that matters is protecting my machine. You got that?
Then you do that alone, sir. I can't be a part of this anymore.
Get the hell out of here, both of you.
But sir...
Get out! You're fired! Go!
Maybe their name isn't on the building, but make no mistake, they're complicit. They know these ideas are being stolen because it's been said out loud more than once while they're present, and they make no effort to resist. Nary a huff of disappointment from these two, again, until murder is on the menu. Which is why we need to show the players why they're here, despite, presumably, knowing what's going on. We need justification for their complicity. Most of us are complicit in systems of oppression, eating meat via factory farming of non-human animals, consumption of television, movies, and games that were developed under poor working conditions, owning a smartphone powered by batteries produced from enslaved children, driving a car, being the CEO of a megalithic corporation. The capitalist systems that help us survive are produced through the exploitation of labor, and so our engagement in those systems is inherently oppressive. This means the dissociative complicity through justification is a really relatable human behavior. We can see someone else struggling, and it's really easy to see how or why they're doing something we'd otherwise categorize as bad behavior. This is my job, my livelihood. I know this company is bad, but these resources are allowing us to innovate. I've been rejected from every other institution. It was either work here or starve. Yes, we're experimenting on animals, but think of the human lives this medicine will save. Now, am I saying we need to root for these technicians, who importantly are not the main characters, who knowingly work for Silicon Valley Beelzebub? Not necessarily. Just as it stands, they aren't characters, and we don't know what they're doing here. If they're the ones who developed the machine, suddenly we understand their presence. They're the true geniuses behind the name Raider. Julia and Harry are the artists having their work stolen. This is a perfect mirror of the external conflict with Mio and Zoe, and also gives us motivation for sabotage. I really like the idea that Julia and Harry are secretly trying to ruin this project. That the side story portals are actually Julia and Harry creating opportunities for Mio and Zoe to safeguard their own stories without Raider's knowledge. It's rebellion, small and risky, but right under the nose of the Empire. And when Raider discovers that those two have been working against him secretly, we get a divisive exchange about how Raider isn't a creator, he isn't an engineer, he isn't anything but an insecure child with deep pockets, and that they're going to stop him. With this as our angle, we can just take the board out of the story entirely. I think they add very little to the plot and just serve to victimize Raider. Instead, we give that screen time to Julia and Harry, dropping hints that they're up to something until the final reveal near the end, where they tell Raider off and are forced out of the room. Raider is now appropriately villainized as a petty fool, a thief, and a fraud, a true imposter. Importantly, he's insecure and lacks self-awareness. These are the two most prominent flaws we talked about reflected in our protagonists. But the difference is, Mio and Zoe change over the course of their arc, and Raider doesn't. He's a flat line of conservative narcissism and corruption, which is defeated, literally, by progress, by change. Which brings us to the final thing we need to change, the other writers. Now, just like Katarina Argon, these writers are going to need names to seem important, but I think first names are perfectly acceptable because for Mio and Zoe, that's all we get from them. And then we just need a couple short lines at the beginning to establish what kind of writers they are, what they're like as people, whether they're excited, anxious, trepidatious, or reluctant to be at Raider Publishing. The story isn't about them, so we don't want to overdo this or spend too much time with them. Just enough detail that they don't present as that set dressing in abandoned theater. I think we can pull them all together by taking Mio and Zoe into side stories that they don't recognize, genres that the other writers mentioned on the outside. Mio and Zoe will realize that this is the other writer's story, and it's starting to bleed through the glitch, giving Mio and Zoe opportunities to close those loops and save the other author's stories. We get a little insight into these other creatives without having to pull them directly into the story. I think we can just give Moon Market and Birthday Cake to the other writers. These do seem strange enough that they could belong to anyone. Again, these little details aren't here to improve the central narrative, but rather to telegraph to the player that if these things have been considered, then naturally, so has everything else. With that, I hope I've sufficiently demonstrated how my process works and what a working relationship with me might be like. I wanted to say a personal thank you to Catherine at Hazelight for looking over my application. I hadn't updated my CV since 2014 when I was still working in the kitchen at Buffalo Wild Wings, so it might have been a mess. Apologies. One last thing, this is my best friend Olin Rogers, the creator and showrunner of Final Space, a show on TBS and Adult Swim, giving me a glowing recommendation. Now keep in mind, we've been friends and worked creatively together for over a decade, so he might go on and on and on about the incredible editorial work I've done on scripts, the work that we did together writing on the Final Space graphic novel, and of course the book that we wrote together.
He's good.